I will lift up mine eyes unto the
Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had the courage to just say, I know God is with me. I know He is overseeing me. Good morning.
Good morning.
And to those online, good morning. This is a very interesting subject and could go in many different directions. I think it's important for each of us in the beginning of every day, in fact, to make sure that before we start in on our day, even start in on our meditation, to greet God, to say, this is the practice I have now. I change it, do different things at different times, but what I do now is, good morning, Master, what shall we do today? And this puts God first. It's really fun, so come up with your own awakening and remembering actually what you're doing. What shall we do today? Because that's really what's being looked for here. And Yogananda's demonstration of that willingness and that knowing that God would take care of him is it's just so striking. It just gives us such a wonderful example of what's possible when we put all of our energy into what we believe is so and really live it. I remember when I was living in the Ananda house, which was a big home in Pacific Heights in San Francisco. It was one of Swami's first experiments in Ananda living, and he wanted to take it into the city. And so there was a lady who was, one of her hobbies in San Francisco was to visit all the designer showcase houses. And that was one of the things she was really keen about. And so she found Ananda. She was very drawn to it. She was drawn to the idea of community in the city. And so she found us a designer showcase house. And the lady who owned it, and it was a couple of $1 million, this was back in 1979, and she didn't know what to do with it. But if you know Designer Showcase, what they do is they invite designers to do one room. So there's no cohesion. Though this big, beautiful house that looked like a fantastic family home from the outside, one of the rooms had tiger stripes on the floor. Others were just decorated. I mean, they could have been pretty. All the furniture was removed, of course. But anyway, it was a mishmash for sure. And so eventually, and Swami was doing wonderful programs in the city to draw people. And eventually, 25 of us moved into that house. Now, the response of the neighbors? This wasn't funny. This was not funny to them. They were quite chagrined. They had found a place in the city to invest and have neighbors who had invested as well, and suddenly 25 hippies moved in next door. Fortunately, one of our group at the time was a very good gardener, so the first thing we did was put in a really nice garden. And the house was visible to a lot of people because there was a man who lived next door who was called the Teddy Bear Man. And he used to be written up in the newspapers. And at a certain time of the year, it was probably this time of the year, he put teddy bears in every window of his house. That was a little goofy. So the goofies were together. Anyway, I remember for me what happened was my father was very, very concerned about my choice. He wasn't so sure this was, on the level. And he wrote me a letter in which he said, so who's going to be responsible for all this rent if other people fall through? And, these are good father questions. They were legitimate. And one of his questions was, who is that man from Scarsdale anyway? So Swami was staying at the house at that time when the letter came through, and I showed it to him. And he looked at it and he said to me, okay, and I had been, I met Swami in 72, so I had been associated with Ananda for many years. He said, okay, Jacqueline, this is not the time for just blowing it off. I want you to sit down and write a letter to your father telling him seriously why you are doing this and what this choice is to put God first. And if you want help from that man from Scarsdale, I will I will help you out. And I said to him, Swami, I think I can do this. And I did write that letter, and that letter arrived when my father was on his deathbed. And I don't know his particular response to it, but at another time, he was an intellectual, and he had actually written a biography of Henry James, so he had skirted the matter of spirituality. And so he had said to me, this is not in any way my choice, but this is a legitimate choice. So then came my deathbed letter saying exactly why, and why it was that Ananda was right was because Master chose me. But all my life, I had this sense at the back of my mind that there was something better. I think better is the word I would use. And I had spirituality in my life through my mother's practice, but I knew that people could be loving. I knew that people could be good. I knew that there was a life, a different kind of life, and Ananda just filled that. So here we have it. I mean, Ananda is an experiment. It's an experiment in a world that is very questioning about, the divine presence. And Ananda asks us, put God first and see how you can live your life. And so we have Master demonstrating that trip to Vrindavan. I mean, extraordinary. And nipping around his heels was the naysayer, Amar. Even after a couple of great things happened, he was I think he was just anxious. And he wanted a few coins in his pocket. And I think that's the way we are. We want just a little escape route. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we had the courage to just say, I know God is with me. I know he is overseeing me. And Swami gave us a way to jumpstart our courage, and that is to say yes. And then one of his disciples added, and make it snappy. Because if we only waded into the shallow end and played around with maybe God is with me, we'd have an opportunity to just run out when we got fearful. We have to jump into the deep end. Now, there's a wonderful story, and it's been made into a movie. And I watched it again last night. I think I watched it, 10 or 15 years ago. It's called Man on Wire. I highly recommend it. This is the story of a French hippie in the 70s who had a pretty strict upbringing, and he came through this time with a really feisty personality. He liked to just get in people's faces and do things differently. So what he did was, when he was in his teens, he became an acrobat. And he also rode a unicycle in the middle of Paris, and he put on a top hat, and he'd do all kinds of juggling. So he became just a street performer. And he had very strict rules. People had to stay outside the circle that he drew on the ground. And then he just played. And he never bought a permit. You know, he was one of these rebellious types. But he collected money from his people who watched him. Anyway, one day he saw in the newspaper that in New York City there was going to be built these twin towers at the World Trade Center. And something came alive in him. And for us, this is the way it was with the autobiography. We said, aha, this is it. But interestingly, for him, this was it. And the thought that came into his mind is, now the towers weren't built yet. It was a little advertisement about, this is what we're going to do. And so he said, I knew right then those towers were built for me. Because by then what he had been doing was doing tightrope walking. And he would walk between, well, the first thing he walked between was the two towers on Notre Dame. And there is documentary evidence of him way, way up there on those two towers on that wire. And when people asked him what that was like to take that incredible risk, he said, I felt safe, I felt joyful, I felt light. That was his ultimate, and he went for it. So he kept exploring the world for places that he could do his high wire act. And he did it in Sydney, and he did it in Great Britain, and then I think in Sydney he walked across the towers of a bridge. And it's all documented, so it's quite thrilling to watch. And then time went by, he still had the idea. And finally, one day he was in a dentist's office, and he read an ad that said the towers were up. They weren't quite finished, but they were up. And he's so desperate, because there was some information there about address and all kinds, phone number or whatever. And he had to get that paper out of the dentist office surreptitiously. So he pretended to sneeze, and he ripped it. He went, sneeze, and ripped it and held on to it. And from that day forward, he began collecting a team of buddies to help him do this thing. Now, that was 200, the towers were 200 feet apart, and they were not sitting, parallel to each other. They were slightly off like that, strangely. I don't quite know why. He was going to be over 1,000 feet off the ground. Now just try to imagine this. And this is the tightrope. This is the walk that we take when we make the choice. Swami said, when we make the choice for the spiritual life, it's like a tightrope walk. And there's lyrics in a song, I think it's The Philosopher and the Boatman, where it says, the pathway is narrow, the pitfalls are deep. Think about him on the Twin Towers. The pathway is narrow, the pitfalls are deep. I mean, just try to imagine. And yet, in fact, we are making that walk of faith. And the other parallel, I think of Swami starting Ananda and the first temple falling down and his getting challenged with a lien on the property. He didn't even know what a lien was. All of those challenges, others would say, well, just don't do it. I mean, it looks like this isn't the thing that needs to happen. Well, Philippe Petit gathered his buddies, and as time went on, because it took them, I think, about 3 years, well, they had to move faster than that, because what was what was good for him was that the top several floors were not completed. And that gave him a point from which he could take all his equipment up and go out. But they always had to be secretive. They always had to be creative, incredibly creative, to work out so how do you attach a wire from one building to the next on the outside? And these guys were just amazing in how they figured it all out. They tried baseball bat with a ball and a little string. They tried everything until they hit on an arrow. And so the way they got the first string, and it didn't have to be big because they just keep adding the thicker ones and thicker ones and thicker ones and thicker ones. But they did it with a bow and arrow in the middle of the night so people couldn't see them. It's just wild. It's just absolutely wild. But this, this metaphor for me, it was just so apt for what we're doing. And he never let the naysayers take over. People dropped out. He had to gather a team with some interesting skills, and some were boyhood friends, and some were people that just wanted adventure, and some were people with real skills. And some of those real skilled people dropped out. And they said, you can't do this. This is crazy. But the one thing that they didn't have, any of them, was the thrill of being on that wire, the thrill of finding that place that brought absolute joy. And he would say, well, this is impossible, but let's keep going. It's great. And he did it. And the pictures are amazing. Not only does he, and again, the other thing he mentioned was, they said, how do you do this? And he said, you just put one foot in front of the other. You just put one foot in front of the other. And he danced on the wire, on the tires. The police finally got up top. They charged him with malicious mischief and something else, which is really strange. But he saw them because they were standing there, and he moved toward them, but he was not going to let them grab him. He went back and forth 8 times. He danced. He lay down. I mean, the courage. But it was joy. It was absolute joy. And he said that lightness of being. I'm convinced next time he'll come in and say, what is this world anyway? It's a dream of God. Let's go to the top man. So that impossible was never an obstacle to him, and it shouldn't be to us. Anything is possible if we put our energy behind it. Incredible need for energy. Let's see. Swami said a very interesting thing about opening to divine grace. He said this: opening to divine grace in whatever way you do is a better investment than any you might make in the marketplace. So let's see if there's any way I want to bring this to a close. Oh, the other thing that one of his friends said, and again, as it got closer and closer to reality, they were trying to figure out what this man had that they weren't getting. And he did a lot of practice on wires that were very close to the ground. And he finally got on a higher one. This is still in the fields in France, outside of Paris, where he lived. Lots of experiments. And they finally they said, I have never, ever seen such concentration. Never seen such concentration. And so this man was preparing to be a yogi, as we are. Thank you.
whisper, God.